This is the news in brief from the United Nations. Marking 1 year since the Taliban took over Afghanistan, on Monday the UN warned about a situation that continues to deteriorate. Over half of the country's population now live below the poverty line, with nearly 23 million food insecure, according to Deputy Special Representative Ramiz Al-Akbarov. And Afghan women and girls have seen a significant rolling back of their economic, political and social rights and a worrying escalation in restrictive gender policies and behaviours. Without the education, work and freedom of movement, they find themselves increasingly relegated to the margins, Mr Al-Akbarov said. Meanwhile, the head of UN Women, Seema Bahous, pointed out that the deliberate slew of measures against Afghan women and girls is also a terrible act of self-sabotage for a country facing huge challenges, including exposure to global economic headwinds. She urged the de facto authorities to open schools for all girls and allow employment for women and their participation in politics. The UN-chartered Brave Commander freighter ship is preparing to leave the Ukrainian port of Izum east of Odessa, carrying 23,000 metric tons of grain to Djibouti in East Africa. From there, the grain will be transferred to Ethiopia under the World Food Programme initiative to unblock food shipments following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Last month, Russia and Ukraine reached an agreement with the UN and Turkey to restart Black Sea grain deliveries, which had triggered global food insecurity. Millions of people in Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan and Sudan in particular are facing dramatic food shortages, the UN warned. About a dozen ships have left Ukraine since the July deal, but they had primarily transported corn for animal feed or biofuel rather than wheat for human consumption. Talks resume on Monday between UN member states aimed at finally completing a UN High Seas Treaty for ocean protection globally. With 2/3 of the world's oceans outside of any country's territory, the largely unregulated waters face many threats, including overfishing and deep-sea mining. If agreed, 30% of the world's oceans will be put into conservation areas by 2030. After 10 years and 4 inconclusive sessions, at least 49 countries have committed to achieving a legal treaty and decided in March that a 5th and final session will be convened with the hope of signing the pact by the end of the year. In addition to COVID-19, which had prevented countries from meeting, disagreements have continued over what should be included. At a UN Ocean conference in June, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres declared an ocean emergency and suggested the egoism of some governments was hampering efforts to agree on a high seas treaty. Katie Dartford, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. The first humanitarian ship chartered by the UN to transport wheat from Ukraine left the southern port of Yuzhny on Tuesday. The 23,000-ton shipment will go to the World Food Programme's humanitarian response in the Horn of Africa, where famine threatens the drought-hit region. According to WFP, a record 345 million people in 82 countries are facing acute food insecurity, while up to 50 million in 45 countries will confront famine without humanitarian support. WFP chief David Beasley acknowledged that although it will take more than Ukrainian grain to stop world hunger, with it back on global markets, there is a chance to stop this global food crisis from spiralling even further. Resumed maritime traffic in Black Sea ports will ease some global supply disruptions and allow Ukraine to empty its grain storage silos ahead of the summer season harvest. The UN Special Envoy for Myanmar, Noeleen Heyzer, has travelled to the country for the first time since her appointment last October. Ms Heyzer, a Singaporean women's rights activist, will focus attention on the country's deteriorating situation. Early last year, the military overthrew the elected government and launched a bloody crackdown on protesters and has been in chaos ever since. Efforts by Myanmar's Southeast Asian neighbours to restore peace have been hampered by the country's recent execution of 4 political activists. Her visit comes a day after the country's imprisoned former leader Aung San Suu Kyi was convicted on additional corruption charges, adding 6 years to her earlier 11-year prison sentence. Despite that, Myanmar's military rulers agreed to a plan to restore peace and stability in April 2021. Little progress has been made as the state has slipped into a situation that some have characterised as a civil war. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has announced the appointment of Simon Steele as the new UN climate chief. Mr Guterres hailed the Grenadian national as a true champion of creative approaches to tackling the global climate crisis. Mr. Steele had previously served as his country's Minister for Climate Resilience and the Environment and has been among a handful of prominent features from vulnerable nations demanding that rich countries step up their efforts to combat the climate crisis. Reacting to a recent scientific report outlining how climate change is already affecting more than 3 billion people worldwide, Steele warned that inaction would be catastrophic. Nothing less than the most extreme measures to cut emissions and adapt to this crisis can be justified, he said. Amidst rising geopolitical tensions and a global energy price crisis, the new UN official will face the task of putting countries back on track to meet international climate goals. Katie Dartford, UN News.
This is the news in brief from the United Nations. During a time of increased economic strain triggered by COVID and repercussions of the war in Ukraine, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, paid a visit to Bangladesh. There, she painted a picture of rising food and fuel prices, a country extremely vulnerable to climate change, and increased polarization triggered by next year's general elections. Ms. Bachelet underscored that it is key for people from various sectors of society to be heard. She encouraged governments to tap into civil society to identify, recognize, and explore the cause of problems. Acknowledging challenges is always the first step to overcoming them, said the senior UN official. She also drew attention to successive UN human rights reports that have documented a narrowing of civic space, increased surveillance, intimidation, and reprisals, often leading to self-censorship. Democratic and civic space, effective checks and balances, and accountability are essential as Bangladesh aims for the next level of development, underscored the UN Human Rights Chief. Turning to Yemen now, where the World Health Organization has provided emergency health and laboratory supplies in an urgent response to meet the needs of communities affected by floods. Since mid-July, heavy seasonal rains have caused extensive floodings, ravaging several governorates in the country. Tens of thousands of people have been affected so far, with more than 35,000 households impacted across 85 districts in 16 governorates, according to local authorities. At least 77 people, including children, were killed in Al-Baida, Amran, Damar, Haja, Marib, and Sana governorates. Moreover, displacement sites and infrastructure were severely damaged. WHO has supported 4 specialized trauma teams and 6 on-duty ambulances, as well as set up 34 epidemiological early warning detection points in Marib, one of the most affected governorates, where thousands of shelters for displaced families were destroyed. Essential emergency health supplies were also released to rapid response and emergency medical teams in other governorates. WHO Representative Adham Rashad warned that the risk of water and vector-borne diseases, including malaria and cholera, is unfolding. With heavy rains expected to continue until the end of the month, WHO has scaled up its response to reach affected people and prevent any potential outbreaks of these diseases. Staying with Yemen, the widespread rains have sparked a looming threat of desert locust infestation. To avoid losses due to the voracious pest, the UN Agriculture Agency, FAO, has, under a World Bank-funded project, delivered desert locust control equipment and machinery to the Ministry of Agriculture, Irrigation, and Fisheries in Aden, and another consignment is expected to be handed over to the authorities in Sana'a soon. During the handover ceremony, FAO Representative Hussein Ghadain called the World Bank-funded project a testimony of the UN Agricultural Agency's pivotal role in reducing malnutrition and food insecurity in Yemen through efficient, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable agri-food systems. This and other FAO projects demonstrate the UN's commitment to better nutrition and food security. She reminded that these are linked to sustainable production and decent livelihoods and will ensure healthy diets for all Yemenis. Liz Kafidi, UN News.
This is the news in brief from the United Nations. Secretary-General Antonio Guterres visited the National University of Lviv in Ukraine on Thursday. There, he reflected on the importance of civil society and academia in the development of modern democracies. Mr. Guterres said that the school had made very important contributions to the organization, specifically to the UN Charter, as Luis' son, a co-author, had graduated from there. The university has also contributed extensively to Holocaust research and to the analysis of human rights violations and genocide. The Secretary-General arrived at Lviv on Wednesday and will go on to Odessa and Istanbul, Turkey, over the following days. While in the country, he will stop by one of the 3 Ukrainian ports participating in the framework of the Black Sea Initiative to export wheat grain. Moving to Afghanistan, the UN mission in the country, UNAMA, deplored Wednesday's attack on a mosque in Kabul. An explosion ripped through a crowded mosque in the Afghan capital, claiming over 20 lives and injuring 40 others, according to media reports. This is the latest in the disturbing series of bombings that have killed and injured more than 250 people in recent weeks. According to UNAMA, it marks the highest monthly number of civilian casualties over the last year. Amidst deteriorating security throughout the country, the UN called on the de facto Taliban authorities to take concrete steps to prevent all forms of terrorism in Afghanistan. On Twitter, the UN mission expressed its sympathies to the families of those killed and called for more support for vulnerable communities. Thursday marks 4 years since the passing of former UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan, regarded by many as a guiding force for good. Across the UN system, messages paid tribute to Mr. Annan, remembering him as an advocate for a better, fairer world. Serving as UN Secretary-General from 1997 to 2005, Mr. Annan championed many significant initiatives. From stronger human rights to global peacekeeping operations, and revitalizing the UN itself by creating the new role of Deputy Chief, an effective ethics office, and zero tolerance for sexual exploitation, his legacy lives on. Ana Carmo, UN News.
This is the news in brief from the United Nations. To meet humanitarian needs triggered by gang violence in Haiti, the UN Humanitarian Agency Chief Martin Griffiths allocated on Friday $5 million of emergency funding. The financing comes amidst the killing of hundreds of people since July in clashes between gangs in Haiti's Cité Soleil, according to the UN Humanitarian Agency's spokesperson Jens Laak. Many others have been trapped in the fighting, which has cut off their access to drinking water, food and healthcare. Mr. Laak pointed out that nearly 280,000 people are estimated to be affected by the situation and that the money is critical right now.
The high level of insecurity in Haiti is compromising humanitarians' access to affected people, for example, for food and cash distributions, but also to basic services such as health and education for between 1 and 1.5 million people trapped in gang-controlled neighbourhoods.
Meanwhile, Martin Griffiths warned in his 40 years of aid work he has not seen such an overwhelming number of crises as is happening now. On World Humanitarian Day, he pointed out that despite this, it's important not to lose sight of hope. Mr. Griffiths gave the example of the resumption of Ukrainian crop exports from the Black Sea port of Odessa as a result of months of negotiations between Russia, Turkey, Ukraine and the UN. Notwithstanding conflicts, hunger, the climate crisis and a pandemic that have left a record 303 million people in need of humanitarian aid, he said that crises also inspire the very best in humanity. In marking the day, he recognised the hope inspired by the courage and conviction of aid workers and paid tribute to the 141 humanitarians who were killed last year. The World Health Organization has advised the use of 2 existing treatments which dramatically reduce Ebola deaths to be given to people of all ages. Publishing its first ever guidelines on the therapeutics to combat the often fatal hemorrhagic disease, the UN Health Agency strongly recommended that 2 monoclonal antibodies known as ansuvimab or Ibanga and Inmazeb be taken. Janet Diaz of the WHO's Health Emergencies Programme said the 2 treatments significantly reduce mortality, with potential to save between 230 and 400 lives for every 1,000 people infected. The UN Health Agency said that both had demonstrated clear benefits and could be used for everyone infected by Ebola, including older people, pregnant and breastfeeding women, children and newborns. However, WHO cautioned that accessing the treatments remained challenging, especially in resource-poor areas. Katie Dartford, UN News.